We are here at the Festival of Media LatAm. My name is Robby Kushner. I'm the VP of Media at Globant. And today we're going to have our panel discussion focused on launching a LatAm service and operating a service in the region, OTT. So, OTT is really hard. There are a lot of components. And LatAm is growing faster based on the developments that we learned in North America and in Europe. And with the adoption of 5G and the territory is on track to grow faster than we ever did. So, here's a quick stat that kind of sets the stage a bit. Latin America's SVOD market comprised of 18 million active paid customers last year, representing an annual increase of almost 30%. So this is where the growth is, and this is why we're all here. So we have panel members here that represent some of the components that make up the service and operations of an OTT platform. We have Lynn Cherry here. She's a digital media consultant and former general counsel at HBO Latin America. Jeremy Howell oversees East Coast operations for RightsLine, a rights management platform. And Humberto Tinoco is a media services black belt for Microsoft Latin America cloud services. So I think it's really interesting. We could have brought 100 people here to show all the different components of the platform. So I'd love to hear a little bit from each of you about what is your role and how it really applies to the LatAm market. So why don't we start with you, Jeremy?
Sure. So, this is specific to LatAm, but also to our global partners. We have a number of partners who use the RightsLine platform to capture their title metadata, their deals, their rights, their inventory, take all this information and feed it off to their downstream DAM systems, their downstream scheduling systems, their downstream ERPs, and overall really drive the processes and products that launch those OTT platforms.
Great. And Lynn, your world?
Hi. So I moved back to Miami about 6 years ago from LA. I was with Fox Interactive working on social media platform. And when I moved back here, I was lucky enough to be involved in the launch of the OTT service for American Mobile as head of legal and business affairs. And I was also doing some business development. And that was super exciting, working on the launch of an OTT platform for a telecom company, which has its own set of challenges, which we can talk about later in the discussion. Yeah. And then from American Mobile, I went to HBO Latin America. I was involved in the launch of the a la carte product, the OTT streaming product for HBO Go. And of course, for a content owner, it has its own set of challenges. Absolutely. Dealing with the distribution partners and data and really rolling out a direct-to-consumer business.
Great.
So.
And Humberto?
Yes, thank you. Well, with Microsoft, everything is around being a platform. So part of that platform focuses on the services that support basically any solution or product that covers up the media requirements. So I'm responsible for those services in the cloud, in the Azure cloud, which is the Microsoft cloud, that support services around media. For instance, we focused on developing AI to analyze content like face recognition, content moderator, the encoding process, closed captioning, and so on, so that our partners or end customers can build on top of that platform and leverage the technology with their own business input. So basically, I'm based out in Mexico, covering up LatAm, and that's basically my role.
That's great. Thank you all for being part of this today. I think it's really interesting that everything is evolving, the market's evolving, the technologies are evolving. So what are the trends at this moment that are really driving your roadmap, that are really influencing all of your decisions?
So I think for us, it's really this idea of change and scalability. How do you pivot your business? How do you scale your systems to support all these different emerging business models and rights types that come out of the market? That's one aspect that's really driving, the features that we're developing for our platform currently.
Yeah, for both of the OTT, right? For both of the OTT platforms that I was involved in, the consumer is so much more in the driver's seat now, and so it's really about understanding what the consumer wants and then being able to act very quickly from a technology perspective to address those needs. And part of that is rolling out content on an SVOD basis, because that's how consumers want to consume content. And a lot of it also relates to how you use data to understand exactly what the consumer wants in the first place, so that you're rolling out features and functionality that the consumers really do want.
Sure, and I'm sure your worlds are constantly colliding with rights management and the
Oh my goodness.
all the studios. It's just all changing.
Yes,
So fast.
of course, you can identify features and functionality that the consumers want, and you can still not be able to pursue those features because you may be stopped by the fact that there are limitations under the agreement, contractual limitations on what you can do with the content vis-a-vis the service.
Yeah, I mean, what services it can be on, how you can leverage the content, how you can surface the content. Yeah, there's a myriad number of different ways you can be stopped by that.
Yeah. And what are some of the trends that are driving Microsoft right now?
Some of the things that I see in the region is that niche players or startups are really fast leveraging technology to build a business that for traditional players took many years and many millions of dollars in hardware investment. And there are a few niche players that are really fast leveraging cloud services and going into market. Those smaller companies are challenging the traditional players, and for some reason, I don't know, traditional players for the investment, for the rights, for many other reasons have take a little longer to adopt new ways to do business and to reach out audiences. One of the success factors behind those niche players is that they born thinking, their mindset is understanding their audiences. Who am I building this content for? How are they going to consume? Because the way we consume content is changing. We are no longer seated in front of a TV for 2-3 hours. We are on the road, we want it on our devices. So when those startups or niche players start building their company around the audiences, that's their biggest strength. And we as Microsoft provide the platform so that technology is not a barrier. Technology is an enabler to precisely do that and deliver those services with audiences first and foremost in their business plan.
Yeah, as complex as this all is, the benefit of building off of what we've learned in the past and what you now have established and they can use, it makes everybody so much more powerful. And in some ways it's easier, even though it's still so hard, but I can imagine starting from scratch and being able to use those cloud services to be able to create powerful, rich features.
Correct.
That may have been very, very difficult or maybe too expensive in the past.
Correct.
So, when we talk about this region, there are differences. And I'm wondering, I'm sure we all have very different points of view of what those differences are, and I would love to hear what you've experienced in the differences. Maybe we'll start with you, Lynn.
Okay. One of the differences that I see is I think it's a little bit, Latin America lags a little bit behind in terms of the subscriber being willing to give their credit card or even having a credit card for these small recurring transactions. And so that's where the concept of a distributor becomes so important, to do deals with companies within Latin America who already have relationships with subscribers and be able to piggyback on that. But then come some of the technical challenges that we've been talking about, and the technical challenges there are being able to integrate with those companies' billing platforms.
Yes.
Because those billing platforms are very diverse. They may be very old legacy platforms or home-built platforms, and so that becomes the speed of rolling out a service like that becomes more difficult, but there is great technology out there.
Do you think the traditional broadcasters are willing to cannibalize themselves? And do you think that's moving as the way it should in terms of creating that digital market that they have to transfer to? They have no choice. And we've seen in the States there was a little resistance, and I'm wondering if we're seeing the same resistance in Latin America. I
think the traditional distributors, they they do see the need to roll out technology that allows them to address these new consumer demands for SVOD services, but it costs a lot of money. It takes a huge investment. So what Humberto's talking about, being able to help those traditional distributors by giving them, a head start to develop that technology is huge, but it still requires a big investment. I think that's.
I think there's not only a barrier in terms of investment. There's also a cultural, a way to approach to a business. I mean, having doing this for several decades gives you a momentum in one direction, and all of a sudden you have to turn that. So the organization, I mean, the people is used to do certain process.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, when you make such a huge investment on infrastructure, on satellite links, and so on, you breathe. You have to look after those assets. If all of a sudden there's a way to do it, and you care a little bit less on that infrastructure and start thinking more on the audiences, it's like a change of in your mind. Like, all I had to do for 30 years is to look after this infrastructure because it's worth hundreds of millions. And now this technology is telling me, oh, don't worry about that. That's just a click in the cloud.
Yeah.
Let's think about this other thing. So it's a lot more complex than just investment. It's resources, mindset, money, and willingness to change.
And have you seen providers like repurposing infrastructure from other territories, scaling out other systems to support LatAm specific distribution?
That's something we actually proposed. I mean, there's not a single business that starts in a big bang. There's got to be a transition. Also, when we were just talking about the lack of having credit card and so on, it's a transition not only for the company but for the market. So you can not necessarily means that you are cannibalizing your business. The market is transitioning as well. So you could have linear traditional channels for those that are not willing to give you a credit card. It's okay, market is evolving as well. But you can also start using your own infrastructure, learning like a SWAT team within the organization to learn a new way of doing things. Yeah. At the same time, the market is evolving. Yeah. So there's a huge opportunity to do that as well.
Yeah. What are you guys seeing as the difference between the region and North America, for example?
So I think it's a different user base. It seems to be a consumption model that's driven by mobile rather than traditional SVOD or pay TV broadband. I think from our perspective, we're once again seeing a lot of integrations in the systems. We're kind of the core of that infrastructure, feeding in the different title information, rights information. We see a lot of challenges around localization. Versioning is a big one right now. The idea that you can have 3 or 4 different versions of a piece of content that you're distributing. How do you track those different versions? How do you track the rights that are specific to each of those different versions, the dub rights, localization rights, etc.? There's a lot of complexity around that right now.
Absolutely.
Is the rights line system, is it available in Spanish, Portuguese, and English?
So it will be soon. Right now it's available in English, but localization, like the actual platform, is something else we're looking at. It's localizing for each territory we have customers in currently.
Yeah, so those are some differences. Now, if someone was looking at this space to try to start this type of platform, what are some of the hurdles that you had to overcome to be successful in this region, and how did you overcome them? We start with you, Humberto.
I think the opportunity, and something that I already mentioned, but this is key, learning from your audiences. That's some of the feedback that I've received from traditional customers is that nobody understands their audiences better than them. And that may have been true, still being true for those customers, that market that is evolving. But there's a sort new of market that is giving you information all the time through the devices, through an omni-channel experience, not only through a mobile device, but what you see the application on your TV. Even nowadays, wearables, virtual reality, augmented reality. If you deliver a consistent omni-channel experience, we as customers are willing to give you a lot of information from us, from ourselves. And building now if you're thinking of going into this business, that's the first thing you had to leverage and learn from your audiences in order to be successful. And that's key at this moment. And technology gives you an opportunity to do that fairly easy, as long as you understand what your first goal will be.
I'd imagine that you're also, with your kinds of like AI, you would have dialect problems and language problems with the cognitive sciences. How do you...
Microsoft Azure nowadays supports over 15, 20 languages. Even, and this is something that somebody in Mexico actually requested me. I didn't know. I had to learn, but interesting. Old native Mayan.
Really?
That's cool.
It's not a language. It's, I don't know how do you say it in English, but it's a little
like
a dialect.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
So we support that.
That's amazing.
And that's where
That's
that's what Microsoft actually does. Focused on where do we deliver the highest value, and let our partners and customers build the things that they want.
Yeah.
And that's just an example of what we do.
I'm sure there are lots of those. Wow. And then from a legal point of view, were there legal hurdles in dealing with the different regions? And I'd love to learn more about that.
Well, rolling out a product direct to consumer, there are legal challenges that you don't have with the wholesale business.
Yeah.
One is data, is how you collect, how you
The different rules.
use, how you store the data. I mean, we've been fairly lucky in Latin America because it takes more after the U.S. model of having a pretty liberal privacy and data security regimen, but I think you see more and more, and in Brazil we've recently seen them look to Europe for more stringent privacy rules. The collecting societies is another issue with music rights, and just consumer protection laws
What
in the
about
country.
piracy? Do you think...
Piracy is a challenge all over the place. I think what we're seeing is copyright laws that aren't they haven't been updated enough to address like the cross-border nature of privacy, and having law enforcement officials cooperate across border to really go after, because the internet pirates, they move all over the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they move very quickly, and it's very difficult, number one, to have the laws that are strong enough, and to have the cooperation among law enforcement officials.
And now, have you seen like efforts to kind of use piracy to drive legitimate adoption and legitimate consumption? Like, is the idea of like, if I'm on YouTube, I see like a pirated video, I can have a hyperlink to go buy that video legitimately off like the Google Play service. Like, have you seen those kind of efforts, or is it more or less just enforcement and taking that content down?
It's more enforcement efforts.
Yeah.
I mean, there are takedown, under the DMCA in the U.S., you have takedown processes, and across the globe you have, you have some rules around requirements to take down content by content owners, but it's a very manual process.
Right.
I mean, there's some technology involved, but it's difficult.
And Humberto, have you guys used that kind of technology for like fingerprinting and takedown? Or?
Yes, actually, there's a whole level of conversation around security, because we understand that this business runs that's the most valuable asset of all, content, and everybody's trying to hack that content. So we provide secure channels to distribute content with a kind of digital fingerprinting that lets you track down who actually access the content, for how long they access the content, check in, check out, timestamps, and so on. And that's basically, there's a whole team looking after that conversation alone.
Companies are required to comply
Exactly.
with certain content security rules under their agreements.
Yes, we actually comply with the Motion Picture Association, very specific compliance agreements that we have on Azure.
And what are some of the hurdles for launching rights management platforms in the region?
I think for us, we have a fairly scalable system that, is hosted in AWS, so users in the region, they're able to access our platform very quickly from any environment. So I think, for us, the challenge has been, that we're still working on is localizing that experience for each of our markets. And I think, right now that seems to be the biggest challenge, just localizing and making our, enterprise experience feel localized for each of our customers in the region.
Are there any technical hurdles that you had to overcome, whether it's technical reach with devices or just anything from that infrastructure point of view? I would assume you have a point of view on that.
Well, network.
Yeah.
The network. It's all over the place in the region. So
it's changing.
And that's a challenge.
Yeah.
But again, we have a ways to control that and mitigate the impact. For instance, we have CDN services through Azure that help us have a consistent delivery of the content through the internet. And the other challenge is the devices itself. In LatAm, we don't have the latest and the greatest device. Mm-hmm. So most of the time, we are thinking of how to leverage the hardware that we have on our handhelds. There's even mobiles that have a specific CPUs for intelligent processing, artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. And when we think of those scenarios, we also have to consider that those are not the devices that the end users have in LatAm. So we have to give it a little time to the market to mature, and as well to be, innovate ways to solve those issues. But this is what we do. This is our company, and we live with solving technical issues all the time.
Yeah, it's a huge issue. I think processing the content for all the various platforms when you're licensing content out to different distribution partners, because they all have different systems and different infrastructure, and so you may be processing content for many different formats, and that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of resources.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, original, I think that's really interesting in your world today, right? Do you think we'll see more original content from LatAm? And what do you think the region's role is in the globalization and aggregation of content? For example, I've been consuming a show recently about this last night, and what I found really interesting about the show was, well, one, that I was given the opportunity to watch it, and then I looked into it a little bit, and I noticed that I read that they were recording it and filming it actually in 2 separate languages, really thinking about globalization. And I wonder how LatAm will, I know that there's different tastes in the region and different types of original programming, but why can't that be more global as well? And I was wondering what your points of view on that are.
Yeah, so you look at a partner like Netflix that's really going big in the region. They're producing so much localized original content, stand-up comedy across the entire region, original series, telenovelas. I think, what they're looking to serve now, when they first rolled out their platform in the region, it was all very global, universal content. Now it's really driving that local experience, having your local audience come to your platform to see the content that they want to see. And I think as far as globalizing then that local content, you take a format that works in LatAm, you translate that format to, if you're Netflix, all of your other global regions. If it worked here, let's try it working over here. Let's record it in 2 different languages. I think, a partner like a Netflix or a Prime that has that global audience, that global platform, I think it's only a matter of time before we start seeing these local formats really translated across their entire platforms and driving that.
To me, I think there's nothing stronger than having really local content to drive acquisition and retention of subscribers, but I also think that there's a huge push to have these global rollouts of content, and I also think that that's driving all the production of original content, so that you own all the rights. You can roll it out across the world.
Absolutely.
On any platforms, in any way that you want.
Yeah.
And because I think rights
Yeah.
are really a huge limitation to doing that. And I think you are seeing like really creative ways to do that. Like I was thinking about Narcos, which was in Spanish and English, and then HBO had a show that was in Portuguese and Spanish. And so I think having content that does go across the globe and really resonates in more than one country is really attractive.
Sure.
Yes. In LatAm, there's always two driving forces: Spanish and Portuguese. And it's been a while since both markets recognized each other and wanted to gain each other market share. So in LatAm, it's fairly common to think at least on those two languages. What I see more often now is that they're also thinking on global distribution, and through technology, they are actually thinking on recording the content in at least 3 different languages: Spanish, Portuguese, and English. And because there's a huge market, and I believe it's fairly addressed from the broadcasters in LatAm, covering up the audiences here in the US. There's a huge market for Latin content in the US.
Yeah, and I'm sure this will all evolve over time as the world starts consuming there's content. We start observing those behaviors. You can imagine we'll learn a whole lot from that as well, and I'll probably see a whole lot more from Norway in the future.
One thing interesting that you made me think about is there has been some pushback when there's been dubbing of English language content where the actor is really where their voice is really well known.
Yeah.
People in Latin America would rather have the subtitles with
That's
the
right.
original
Language.
the original language, right? The English language. So that's an interesting perspective, strategy, right, to think about.
Absolutely. All right, so this one's a little more on the fun side. I'd like you to predict the future. What's going to be the big hot topic, the big win, or the looming pitfall in the next 5 years in the OTT space in LatAm?
I think broadband penetration. How do you get these SVOD services, more widespread adoption across the region?
Yeah. Broadband. Yeah, and with 5G coming out, you can imagine that's going to change everything, and mobile will grow so much faster than it did for us, and so much more powerful.
Yeah.
It's just going to be exponential. Absolutely.
Right. I do think that the 5G mobile providers have a huge advantage once they roll out in Latin America, which will probably be quicker than we think, the way technology is moving. I also think the traditional distributors have a huge advantage because they have the subscriber relationships and they have the ability to aggregate the content because they already have relationship with the content providers. The one thing that's missing is the stomach to invest in the technology and make, change their mindset in a way that they're better meeting the consumer demand.
Yes. I think Omni-challenge great experiences. That's the future, and that's the future I hope for. Leveraging all the different ways we interact with technology, through technology, and consume content. One example would be augmented reality. How can we interact with each other without being isolated with virtual reality?
Yeah.
How do we interact with each other while we are consuming the same content? And we can have on-demand, truly on-demand content, interacting with each other through an interface which is technology. And not only augmented reality, but different natural interfaces between devices or technology.
What do you mean by natural?
Natural devices, like virtual reality itself, it's a way to engage our listening and sight. But new technologies with touching, having sensorial experiences, interacting with each other, consuming a content. So to me, that would be like the future I hope for.
Yeah.
And I know from my side of the business that the building blocks are already there, and all it takes is the baseline is already there. All it takes is an ecosystem that teach them, so that with machine learning it starts, picking up by themselves,
Sure.
so that we can have these new experiences. Hardware, it's something that's still very expensive. That's services are there. However, the hardware, the interfaces are still expensive. But eventually, it's going to be just a matter of economics.
Yeah. I would assume from your point of view, AI and machine learning is going to exponentially grow, and in a few years, who knows what we'll be building off of. So how are you guys planning for the future and creating an environment to be able to grow and adapt and maybe adjust as you are observing how AI and machine learning is evolving?
Well, this has to do a lot with the data initiatives. It's a little away from the media industry, but it's the basic building block of all this. How do you make that data not only available, but structured, and the services learn from it without someone having to teach them? So that's machine learning based on a lot of data. And if we're thinking of these natural interfaces, we're having data of all sorts. We may think of data as my phone number, but that's just a very small piece of data. Once we start interacting in new ways, we will have other kind of data, more personal and more natural data from ourselves, and learn from it and build those future services.
That's such a powerful tool that companies need in the future, is that access to data. And I think that's driving a lot of decisions that companies are making on what their business model is in the future.
And I think from the legal aspect, we're just starting on that, and we need to talk about that, and we need to ask for companies to actually protect and do not give our business for free. No?
Yeah.
Nothing is free. So when you have an email account for free, it's not.
No. Well, data's always been a conundrum. In order we can be more powerful, the more we get. Audiences aren't necessarily trusting, and we need to find that balance.